Once upon a time, in a land far away, people spoke of fairies. Journey with me to take a closer look at folklore and the supernatural. Please join me for the Philly Ghost Hunt Professional Series. Watch Part 2 of Folklore, a closer look at the supernatural. I thought we could actually begin by you telling us a little bit about your interest in the paranormal. And from talking to you earlier, I know that you preferred another term, supernatural. Mm-hmm. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about that and also tell us why you prefer the term supernatural.
Sure. Well, I know that supernatural is not a perfect word for this category of experience, but one reason why I tend to favor it is simply because it's more present in scholarly literature, particularly in anthropology and folklore, which are, that's kind of the area in which I work. We do what's called ethnography, which is a form of research where we go and we live with people. We do something called participant observation, which essentially means that we live with people and we work with people and we participate in their daily lives, or at least the things that they do that we're most interested in, to the extent we're able, ideally for extended periods of time, so that we gain as close to an insider's perspective as we can. It's never fully possible to bridge that gap. But increasingly over the past several decades, ethnographers have turned to studying their own cultures as well as cultures that they identify as different from their own. So there's a lot of connection or potential connection there. But using a term that's in use in scholarly literature is one reason why I use that term. Also, I'm hesitant to use the term like paranormal because it often seems to me to be a part of a very Western-centric approach that attempts to couch anomalous experience in the language of Western scientific rationalism. And
I agree. Yeah.
Not to impugn science at all. Science is great. Please get your shots, everyone. Especially now. But science is a belief system, the same as any other. To make that claim is not to impugn science. It's not to say that science is wrong or science is false. But science is a way of gathering information about the world and then interpreting that information according to a pre-existing set of rules. And the way in which science has kind of percolated out throughout contemporary Western cultures and global cultures has led people to believe that that first of all, that to be rational means to be scientific, when those two words are not synonymous with one another. Rational and scientific.
I agree.
They're not exactly the same. And not everybody believes, or not everyone accepts, that a scientific orientation to the world is the only way to arrive at true knowledge of the world. And of course, we can easily point to institutional religions as an example of that. It's not possible to verify the existence of God according to the tenets of Western science. It's not possible to disprove either. One cannot prove a negative. One cannot prove that God does not exist according to the tenets of Western empirical thought. But again, not everybody even feels within Western societies that scientific approaches apply to every area of existence. God resists experimentation. So the language of the paranormal and the attempt to bring scientific method into experiences which for many people are outside of measurable, quantifiable life, but are nonetheless very real, is something that I don't want to necessarily, I don't want to disagree with that, but I also don't want to sound as though I'm endorsing that. So if I were to use the word paranormal, it might sound as though I was taking sort of a Western scientific approach, or at least an approach that is adjacent to Western science. And that's not really what I'm doing. My interest is ultimately not in whether or not claims of supernatural phenomena are real or not. I have no interest in proving or disproving anything in the work that I do. I'm a lot more interested in understanding how people make sense of these experiences and why they matter, both in the lives of individuals and in sort of broader cultural contexts. So in Ireland, for example, fairy tradition has a really rich and really complex history going back many hundreds of years. The issue of belief in the fairies is complicated. It's hard to say to what extent, if any, people have actually literally believed in the fairies to be true historically, and to what extent the fairies have been sort of social tools of resistance to dominant ideologies like Irish Catholicism, for example, is historically has been very dominant on that island and has had a massive impact on all sorts of cultural and historical developments there. So to what extent does fairy tradition represent people pushing back against institutional faith? Setting aside for a minute the issue of literal belief in the fairies. So there are a lot of complexities involved in belief, but as anyone who identifies themselves as a religious or a spiritual person can likely attest, not all beliefs are laboratory based. But even the beliefs that are ostensibly within the purview of Western science, like beliefs about the sun rising in the morning, those are not beliefs that the average person has verified for themselves. Most people haven't done the observation necessary to conclude, according to the tenets of Western science, that the sun will in fact rise tomorrow, or that, the coronavirus, to use a particularly politicized example, but not everyone has done the laboratory experimentation to have an understanding of the coronavirus and how it works and how it infects and spreads and kills. But most of us, nevertheless, take as truth about the world certain assertions. So if I say that the sun is going to rise tomorrow, most of your audience would probably agree. There may be some outliers, but most of your audience would agree. And their agreement comes from two places. It comes from the authority of experts. So people who have studied these phenomena and made measured observations of them and whose ideas have become convincing in the society as a whole. That's one place. And the other place, the other thing that informs their belief is personal experience. So that was a long answer to a short question, but I like this supernatural because it does justice to the fact that not everybody agrees on this stuff.
I agree. Great points. Great points.
Oh, thank you.
So, can you tell us a little bit about how you feel, why you, from what you've studied, why people are kind of interested in ghosts and lore and these stories, and maybe tie it into how they change and still fit with our popular culture?
That's an interesting question. A good couple of questions in there. I think certainly in the contemporary United States, many people perceive, particularly folks who may have not always had the most fulfilling spiritual lives, whatever that means for them, but others as well. There's a perception that American public culture lacks a spiritual element. I mean, not to wade, again, too deeply into current politics or anything, but, arguments can be made that we are strictly, officially a secular society based on the Constitution. On the other hand, a strong argument could be advanced that we are a de facto Judeo-Christian society based on the dominant politics and the presence of Judeo-Christian imagery and language in, throughout American public life, and certainly the current political administration and its handling of religiously informed events. Nevertheless, I think part of living in a highly pluralistic society, such as the contemporary United States, when I say pluralistic, I mean one in which people of many, many different religious and spiritual backgrounds coexist and bring different ideas and beliefs to the table. But part of the reality of pluralism is, for some people, I think, a sense of fragmentation, a sense of there being so many ideas about the universe and the soul or the spirit and, human nature and the purpose of life and all of these other big questions, that it can be difficult for people to know where to turn to find answers about those things. Some people are purely interested in the supernatural because they find it entertaining, which is entirely valid. Some people are interested in things like paranormal investigations because, among other reasons, it can point to the possibility of life after death, to something more tangible than is often offered in more institutional settings. Some people are attracted to traditional stories and accounts of the supernatural because they are often very good stories, but again, because they can kind of do all of this. They can provide a kind of anecdotal evidence about, alternative possibilities regarding reality. They also can just be really, really good yarns. So there's always kind of a tension between belief or the possibility of belief and entertainment and other things too, like social critiques. Folklore as a term covers a lot of different things. For those of us in the discipline, folklore means a certain mode of cultural expression. It doesn't just refer to old stories or old forms of material culture like baskets or quilts, although all of those things can be studied as folklore, absolutely. But folklore as a concept encompasses the day-to-day, normal, ordinary part of people's cultural lives and the ways in which they express themselves in culture. And the supernatural, for many people, is not a part of their daily life. So for those folks in particular, I think it can be really interesting when they encounter forms of folklore that do feature the supernatural very centrally. And I think the same is true with popular cultural stuff. I mean, if one lives a particular kind of contemporary American life, the scares of horror films can offer a nice sort of escape from boredom. There are as many answers to the question of why people like this stuff as there are people.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, sometimes it's experiential. Sometimes it's just for the thrill. It's kind of like why people like roller coasters.
Yeah, I think you're right.
A safe way to experience something, and it's very controlled, or it's perceived to be so. And the element of ultimately you're safe and will be okay is what you can kind of count on. Yeah. Interestingly enough, though, one of the things that I've always kind of looked at is that there tends to be a particular interest in, for example, demons. People really enjoy going to the dark side. They are very intrigued by it. The darker, the better, almost. And have you kind of seen that, or?
Certainly within the sort of horror sphere, absolutely. Horror films and fiction really kind of rely on that darkness darkness to provide horror, to provide a feeling of wrongness or evil, or however people define horror, which also differs. Demons are like any sort of supernatural entity. I'm assuming you're using the word in the sort of generic Judeo-Christian sense of a malevolent, non-human entity.
Yeah.
I think there are a lot of potential reasons for interest in that, but the idea of possession is a particularly compelling one for many folks, and a source of fear, I would argue, because it involves the complete loss of oneself, the complete subsuming of one's own identity into a hostile foreign presence that one cannot expel. That, I think, for a lot of folks is a very frightening potential. And the presence of forms of spirit possession in real world cultures, it's quite prevalent in a lot of places in the world, and has been studied by anthropologists and others in a lot of different contexts, from the writing of practitioners of voodoo and other West African derived traditions in the New World, by the spirits of the West African gods, the Orishas, to spirit possession in trance contexts, where other kinds of trance contexts, I should say, to demonic possessions and the Vatican's own, training of exorcist priests. There was a recent documentary film by William Friedkin, the director of The Exorcist. But this was a documentary film about Father Gabriel Amorth, a very well-known Catholic exorcist. Unfortunately, a failure as a documentary on a number of levels.
Really? I was going to watch it. I haven't had the opportunity to watch it yet. I actually did find it. And I had interest in it, as well as his books. And so
I've not read Father Amorth's books, although I have one of them on a shelf, but I confess I haven't actually read it yet. I need to. The film, unfortunately, was very, very sensationalized. It was presented in a way that made it difficult to take seriously. There were sound effects that were pretty clearly added. It was very overwrought, and didn't strike me as a particularly respectful treatment of the people involved.
That was the feeling I had for it. So whatever that block of time was that I was going to actually watch that, I decided I'll put that off for later and do something else.
Yeah,
I just saw some previews, and I was like, this is no, it's more shrieks and trills, and there's it's not really substantive in terms of.
I think you should trust your gut on that.
Okay.
It's worth watching kind of as a curiosity to see what the problems with it are.
The film itself, not actually the exorcism, right?
Yeah, not right. Yeah. Which is strange to say, because in the world of horror fiction, The Exorcist is my favorite film. It's possibly my favorite film of all time.
Is it?
So the contrast between the two is
quite interesting. Still horrifies me.
Me too. It's a terrifying movie, but I find it ultimately really uplifting.
You do?
Because it's very much about. Am I still here?
Yeah, you're here.
Okay, my computer decided right at that moment.
I heard a bing. Yeah.
It's ultimately about the triumph of good over evil, although not admittedly under ideal circumstances. But there's such human warmth in that film, and such, so many instances of people being genuinely kind to one another, that brings a tear to my eye to watch it.
That's a great perspective on it. It is really, and that's true. Everything you said, I find it horrifying. Yeah. I actually, I feel that the work I do is very different from, kind of the demonic side of things. And I'd like to keep it there. Because I actually do believe, in that stuff. And I think that, it is absolutely terrifying, and not anything that most human beings are ever equipped to deal with. So, to encounter such a thing is not what I wish to do at
Mhm.
all. And so like I just kind of don't, it's not my focus. And every time people get excited about it or want to, I'm like, and I often wonder, like, maybe they don't really understand what they're doing. Like, maybe there's no real connection because this is truly a horrific thing. Not, you know, if you believe it and if you hear some of the stories
Oh,
that go
sure.
along
Yeah,
with
yeah.
it. Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting point, Donna. I think I can't speak to what's in the heads of every individual
No.
who chooses to engage with stuff. I mean, it could be maybe that for some folks, they're sort of wrestling between skepticism and belief, and they're like they want to know, but they're not quite convinced. And belief is often a tricky thing because it has so many degrees of
Yeah.
of strength in people, and
Yeah.
different people engage in different ways with their beliefs based, at least in part, I think, on the conviction with which those beliefs are held. But that's only one factor among many.
Yeah. So, yeah, but back to ghosts.
Mm.
What do you have a favorite story that you'd like to share?
Favorite story about a ghost. That's a tough one. Let's see. Well, one that appeals to me very much as a folklorist is the very, very famous contemporary legend known as the Vanishing Hitchhiker.
Ooh, yeah.
That's a great story, and I should explain my use of terms. The term urban legend was kind of made popular by a folklorist named Jan Harold Brunvand back in the early 1980s, who published a book called The Vanishing Hitchhiker. And he used the term urban legends to kind of refer in a vague way to a particular type of story, a particular type of narrative set in contemporary American spaces. A legend, by the way, when folklorists use the term legend, we're referring to a very specific kind of story. A legend is a story that is told as if it's true, or at least possibly true. It may be very subject to debate. It's set in real historical time, although it may be in the very distant past, but it still is set in real time, which is an important distinction from myth. Myth is a genre, as we use the term, myth is a genre that is set outside of normal history. So myths are often about the creation of the world or the creation of the universe before the beginning of normal historical time. And they often feature gods and non-human characters or humans in forms that are different from the forms that humans would eventually come to take.
Yeah, I appreciate you pointing out the differences in genre. I love genre, and I think it is a great starting point because it helps everyone define, puts parameters on it. Now you understand the category that this is going to exist in. And it can help you with
it's
your
good for talking with,
perspective.
so to speak.
When I teach, the first thing I do is I'm starting with genre, and we look at that.
Yeah.
That's my starting
point. And of course, in literary genres and folkloric genres are different in a number of ways. And one way that folkloric genres, are a little different is that these are folklore, as I said before, is defined by its presence in everyday life. So because folklore genres are genres that are present in and used by people in their normal lives, generic boundaries are really slippery and really permeable. There's a lot of sliding back and forth. I lay out those genre terms only kind of as you indicated, Donna, as a starting point. And I tell my own students, here are the genre terms that we often use, and we're probably going to end up totally scrapping them or using them the wrong way as we go through our discussion of these things, but they're a useful starting point.
Yeah.
One important thing, though, regarding both myth and legend as genres, is that for folklorists and other scholars who study this stuff, they never mean false. They never, ever mean untrue stories. It really bothers me when in ordinary speech, people use those terms in a sort of dismissive way, and they say, oh, that's just a myth, or they combine the term urban legend and myth. So now oftentimes you hear, oh, that's just an urban myth.
And superstition.
That really makes me shake my fist in anger. We never use those terms to mean false or untrue. A myth is a sacred truth. So from the perspective of folklorists and others who study myth, for example, the two creation stories in the biblical book of Genesis are myths. I think a lot of people who are accustomed to the normal, ordinary use of the term myth to mean a false belief or a false narrative would recoil at that. If I say that the creation story from Judeo-Christian faiths and Islamic is a myth, people would be potentially bothered by that, because they're hearing the term myth to mean a false story.
Yeah, they have.
That's not at all what I mean. I'm not making a claim about its truth or its falseness. I'm calling it a story that makes truth claims about the world, but it is a sacred truth. It is not a falsehood.
Right.
So when I use the word legend, I don't mean a falsehood. Like I love the show Mythbusters.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
That's a great show, but I wish they found a different word to use other than myth. The Vanishing Hitchhiker contemporary legend, and so I'm sorry, I got a little sidetracked there, but within the category of legend, urban legends, which we now usually refer to as contemporary legends, are ones that are set much closer to us in time and space. So if I tell you a legend about King Arthur or about Robin Hood, those are fairly remote from us in time and in space, separated by hundreds or thousands of years. But if I tell you a story like The Vanishing Hitchhiker, which I'll tell in just a moment in summary form, but they tend to be much, much closer to the teller and to the audience in time and in space. And contemporary legends in particular tend to move around a lot. Like many, many people will have heard a version of that story, but set in a different location, which is pretty fascinating. So the Vanishing Hitchhiker story is, again, this is just in summary form, but it's a story about a male driver, a guy in a car, is returning home from somewhere at night, and he sees a young woman on the side of the road who is hitchhiking, and he normally is not the type of person to pick up a hitchhiker, but he takes pity on her and decides to give her a ride. So he pulls over, and the young lady gets into his car, and she's wearing it. I think it's a sweater. It depends on the version of the story, but she's wearing a sweater. And she doesn't say much on the ride except really to tell him where she lives. And he determines that her home is on the way to his own. So great, no problem. He takes her to her house and he drops her off, and she thanks him and gets out of the car and leaves, and he drives away. The next morning, he realizes that the young woman has left some belonging of hers in the car, in this case, say a sweater. So he thinks, well, I'm heading back in that same direction today anyway. I'll stop by her house, because he remembers where he dropped her off. I'll stop by and return this item to her. So he does that. He pulls up to her house and gets out and goes and knocks on the door. And an older couple answers the door. And he holds out the sweater and he says, I'm very sorry to bother you. I gave maybe your daughter a ride home last night, and she left this in my car. And he gives the sweater to them. And they look at the sweater and they look at each other and they look back at the man and they say, well, this does belong to our daughter, but she died 3 years ago.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's a really common story that I don't know how much it's told these days, but at the time of Brunvan's book, there were a lot of instances of it that he encountered in archives and that I think were still in circulation at the time. So these are, yeah, they're stories, urban or contemporary legends, are stories that move around a lot, that people recount in different settings. And they really complicate the issue of belief, because there may well be people who have had experiences very much like that one. So identifying it as a patterned narrative doesn't mean that people haven't had that experience. And interestingly enough, in 2011 in Japan, there was the horrible, tragic tsunami followed by the meltdown of the nuclear reactor in Fukushima. And in the months and years following that, cab drivers in the area started to tell stories of picking up passengers who turned out to be ghosts.
Wow.
The spirits of people who died in the tsunami or after the earthquake or the tsunami. So there's a really interesting relation there between, or potential relation, I should say, between storytelling and belief and experience. I can't say that there's a one-to-one link between that generic version of the Vanishing Hitchhiker that I just told you and the situation in Japan.
I had 2 points to make. One is that the hitchhiker, sometimes it's told with a little twist at the end, where the driver actually goes to the cemetery. Have you heard that one?
It's been a while.
Or that one is kind of attached to, they went to a dance.
Okay.
Have you heard that one?
I mean,
yeah, they were like at a dance, and she was a ghost the entire time.
And he actually went on a date with a ghost.
Yeah.
Wow.
Sometimes that's the story.
That's interesting.
Sometimes it's the hitchhiker, and he picks her up, and it ends with like him going to the house and the parents saying, passed away several years ago, and then, but it doesn't stop there. Rather than them giving telling him that, he goes to the cemetery, locates the grave, and finds his sweater there.
Oh, you know what? I think that does ring a faint bell, actually. Well, so the summary version I gave was just sort of very condensed and just.
That I think that's the most frequent story told, and that's the one that I've always heard. But recently, I've been seeing somewhere, it actually ends with him going to retrieve the sweater at the cemetery.
I love that. Well, that's a great illustration of another really important point about what folklore is and how folklore works, at least from the perspective of academic folklorists. We always think of folklore as whatever else it is. There are always two sort of cultural imperatives or processes that are sort of going on that help us to identify something as folklore. And those two processes are usually called tradition and variation. Tradition, of course, refers to something remaining recognizably the same over time and from one iteration to another. And variation, of course, just means change over time. So your examples there are really good examples of tradition and variation. Like there's a clear link there, the mistaken identity of a person thought to be a normal living person after the fact being found out to be a ghost. And the variation in the forms of those specific narrative details. Yeah. It's really interesting.
It is, yeah. The other thing is the Japanese. They very much enjoy ghost lore, horror, everything that they I'm really intrigued by that is such a part of their culture.
Yeah, ghosts are very prominent in Japan. I lived there for a little over a year.
Oh wow!
And, it's my favorite place in the world. I love it.
Wow, I have a few followers who are Japanese, and they enlightened me on it, which I
so kana. Minasan konnichiwa. Hope everybody's doing well.
Yeah, and I completely off topic. I really love Japanese green tea. Just completely off topic. Everybody goes for Chinese green tea. I really love Japanese green tea. And,
I love it too.
And somebody actually told me how to distinguish the good Japanese tea from the not so great Japanese tea, what's really authentic Japanese tea. So now when I go shopping for it, I know what to look for.
Now you're a pro.
That's